Buenos días a todos. Habla Beto Vargas, presidente de AMTI. Muchas gracias por conectarse a este webinar. Les comento que es un webinar en inglés, entonces, pues, antes que nada, muchas gracias a toda la comunidad AMTI por tomarse el tiempo para conectarse a este webinar. A partir de ahorita voy a hacer el switch a inglés para estar en contacto con nuestros anfitriones de Ayana. Pues bueno, nuevamente muchas gracias a todos por conectarse. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Beto Vargas. For those that doesn't know me, I'm president of AMTI. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join to this webinar that Ayana is sharing with us today. Thanks also to all the Ayana staff that is putting together this webinar. Thank you, Debbie, Sherry, and John for putting together all this information and sharing all these thoughts around UIIA that you have in place in the United States. Also, I want to thank Steve Kepler from Ayana for making the efforts of putting all this together. And also, again, thanks all the AMTI members for joining today. The idea is to get some of the know-how and experiences that Ayana has had during the implementation and the operation of the interchange agreement they have in place in North America mostly. So again, thanks to the Ayana staff for making this possible. I also want to thank Debbie Sasko. She's Associate Vice President at Ayana. She takes care of the UIIA operations, so she'll be leading and presenting today's information. Also, I want to mention that you can ask questions. There's a platform on the webinar where you can write your questions. Those can be done in Spanish or English, as you choose, and they will be responded at the very end of the presentation. So thanks again, everybody. Debbie, we can start now with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Beto. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. As Beto said, as we go through the webinar, should you have any questions, just use the question panel in the GoToWebinar to your right-hand side, and we'll cover those that we can at the end of the session. Any of them that we don't get to, we'll certainly respond to you following the webinar today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The information we're going to cover today is kind of give you an overview of the UIIA, the benefits of the program, how it's administered both by IANA staff and also by the committee that oversees the agreement, as well as information in regards to how we collect insurance and what type of information we collect under the program, and some other pertinent facts regarding provisions that are contained in the agreement, as well as our binding arbitration process that is offered to UIIA participants as a way to hopefully resolve billing disputes between parties. And then we'll go over some frequently asked questions that we often get regarding the agreement itself. The UIIA agreement actually was developed in the 1970s. It's an actual contract. It's an industry interchange contract that sets forth the terms of interchanging intermodal equipment between motor carriers and equipment providers, which would be the steamship lines, rails, and leasing companies. We operate under a business review letter that was issued by the U.S. Department of Justice. So we don't discuss any type of commercial matters under the UIIA as far as charges or any type of economic issues. Those are all covered within the equipment provider's addendum to the base agreement. IANA administers the agreement, and it was based on a merger of three separate organizations, the ITA, the IMA, and the NRA. Those three organizations came together and formed IANA, and in 1991, that merger took over the administration of the UIIA. The types of information we collect under the agreement include insurance information, motor carrier profile information that would include a company's US DOT number, their motor carrier operating authority. We also use a standard carrier alpha code that is issued by National Motor Freight Traffic Association, and that is a 4-letter code that's used to identify the trucking companies within the terminal operating systems. So it's a unique code that's assigned to that company, and across the board it's used by not only the equipment providers, but also the facilities where the trucking companies interchange equipment. Some benefits of participation is from the motor carrier perspective would be the biggest one probably being the fact that by the motor carrier signing one agreement, the UIIA, it eliminates their need to sign separate agreements with individual steamship lines or railroads or leasing companies that they want to do business with. They execute the UIIA document, the base agreement, and they provide us with one certificate of insurance that covers all the requirements of the companies that they wish to do business with under the UIIA. So that certificate would be made out to IANA, and we would be the certificate holder on that certificate, and then the agent would then list the individual companies that the trucker is going to do business with as additionally insured on their policies, as well as provide any limits that would be required under the specific types of coverages. We also have a web portal that participants use to access their information. Motor carriers can go into that web portal and view their interchange status with any of the companies that they wish to do business with. They can see if for some reason they're not approved for a specific steamship line or rail or leasing company. They can click on the not approved label that's in the web portal, and it will clearly show them what additional information is needed for them to become approved for that specific company and actually then have a valid interchange for them under the UIIA. In regards to insurance, IANA works Monday through Friday, 8 to 8, in order to cover our West Coast carriers as well. But there are times on the weekends where there are companies that may get stuck at a port or may have a problem getting in and out of a facility due to insurance information being lacking. So our system allows agents to come online 24/7 to submit insurance on behalf of motor carriers, so that there doesn't need to be a body at IANA to do that update for them. They can register to become an authorized insurance agent with us, and then they can submit that insurance on behalf of their motor carrier insured, and it would then update their account, and then there would be automatic batch jobs that would allow that update to then be filtered to the individual steamship line, rail, or leasing company, as well as the facilities that those equipment providers do business at. We also do proactive notifications to motor carriers in regards to insurance, such as if their insurance is due to expire, we send a notice out 30 days in advance to let them know that they have an upcoming policy that's due to be renewed, as well as we then send a 7-day notice if we haven't received the renewal by that date. And then if for some reason we don't get the information by the expiration date, they would then receive another notice letting them know that their policies have lapsed and that they now, their status within individual providers has been impacted based on the fact that their insurance has lapsed. Benefits from an equipment provider's perspective would parallel in some respects as regards to the same benefits that a motor carrier sees. However, it also saves the provider from administering multiple interchange contracts with motor carriers. So we have over 8,000 motor carriers in our database. So for a provider that does business, say one of the larger providers that may do business with a lot of motor carriers, thousands of motor carriers, the UIIA is allowing us to administer that for them versus them having to administer all those contracts and go out and get executed copies of all those documents, as well as collect the insurance for those specific motor carriers and maintain and track that information on behalf of their company to ensure that they're only doing business with valid motor carriers that have insurance in place that meet their requirements. Each equipment provider that is a participant in the UIIA, we develop a template for them within our database that actually identifies what their insurance requirements are, as well as if they have any type of additional insured information required. If they require to be listed as an additional insured on the policy, that's tracked within that template. And then if they have maybe other documentation that they may require to be executed, we have the ability to do that as well. So that's all maintained in a template. And as we receive insurance on behalf of the motor carrier, our system in the background then takes all of that insurance information and bounces it off that equipment provider's template to determine whether that specific trucking company has a valid interchange with the steamship line, rail, or leasing company. The equipment providers also have online access to see at any time whether a trucking company has a valid interchange with them. They also have reporting capabilities where they can pull a list of approved or not approved motor carriers at any time. They can also go into the web report platform and pull, say if they're looking for specific carriers with a certain limit of insurance, they have the ability to pull that type of information too. So they set the parameters for the reports that they want to pull, and then our system would generate the report in an Excel file and then email that report to the individual equipment provider. Each equipment provider, as a signatory to the UIIA, also has to have their individual addendum to the agreement. So you have the base UIIA agreement that has specific terms and conditions in order to interchange equipment between the two parties. But an equipment provider also has an addendum that sets forth any type of economic terms and conditions that they require a motor carrier to comply with in order to do business. And they can include, like if they have free time and per diem terms and conditions for the use of their equipment, that type of information would be included in their addendum. They can also have specific processes that they may require a motor carrier to follow if the equipment is, say, lost or stolen, or if it needs to be repaired. Those types of terms and conditions would be contained in the individual provider's addendum to the UIIA. So the base agreement, in addition to the provider's addenda, is considered the complete agreement, the total agreement that is between the two parties. As I mentioned, we have over 8,000 motor carriers within the UIIA. Not all equipment providers do business with all 8,000 carriers. So a provider has the ability to indicate when they join the UIIA whether they just want to do business with a specific list of carriers that are within our actual database, or they can open their participation up to all companies that do business to allow them the ability to do business as long as they meet their requirements. So we have the ability to manage a specific listing of carriers where it limits the number of motor carriers that we're managing for a specific provider, or they can open it up to all UIIA motor carriers, and then any one of those trucking companies that would meet their requirements would be shown as having a valid interchange for that specific equipment provider. There are times that a provider will come to us and ask us to do an audit of a specific motor carrier's insurance to ensure that the coverage the agent has provided us is in fact in place. That sometimes is related to a specific carrier, sometimes it may be related to a specific insurance company, but certainly we have the ability to do that on behalf of a provider. If they would come to us and ask us to do an audit on a specific carrier's insurance, we would certainly do that to confirm that the information we have on file is in fact in place and endorsed as the agent has provided the information to us. Some value-added benefits of UIIA participation include two other programs that IANA administers, one being our terminal feed service. Under the UIIA, the interchange status information is provided to the individual equipment provider, the leasing company, the steamship line, or railroad. But many times they have the information and it doesn't get to the actual facility that that particular provider is using. So what UIIA did is they developed the terminal feed service many, many years ago that would then allow us on behalf of that equipment provider to actually directly send interchange status information to the terminal directly. So we have close to 100 facilities in the United States and Canada that receive information on behalf of equipment providers that use our terminal feed service. And what that terminal gets is they get credentials to come in and pick up that information from us. We do updates on an hourly basis. So every hour, the facility comes in and picks up a file from us that indicates any updates that have been done to a carrier's insurance during that hour, whether it's gone from an active status to an inactive status or vice versa. And there is also a web platform for those that don't, facilities that don't need to integrate that information into their own internal system. We have a web platform that simply allows the facility to do a lookup and obtain that same information. Another service that is a value-added benefit of UIIA participation is our street interchange application. And under our street interchange application, we've developed a web platform that allows motor carriers and equipment providers to communicate regarding requests for the ability to either street turn or street interchange a unit off terminal. So the street turn would be a single motor carrier that wants to use an import box for an reuse it for an export move. And then the street interchange, of course, would be a motor carrier taking the equipment out of the facility and then off terminal wanting to interchange that unit to a second motor carrier so that that second motor carrier can reload that unit and then bring it back to the facility. So that all of those requests from a motor carrier require authorization from the equipment provider before they can be done. So we did not have a platform under the UIIA to do that until we developed the street interchange application. So what it does is it provides an efficient method to allow these two parties to communicate with one another to make the street turn or street interchange request, and then allow the equipment provider then to communicate back to the motor carrier whether they approve that request or not. And then what we do is we capture an electronic record of that exchange. So from the time it moves from an import to an export move, if it's a single motor carrier requesting a street turn, or from the time it moves from motor carrier 1 to motor carrier 2, if it's a street interchange. So that in the future, should there be any discrepancy as to whose possession the equipment was in, or whether it was under import per diem terms versus export per diem terms for the street turn, then we'd have an electronic record of that the parties could access to ensure that billings are done appropriately and responsibility for damage as required under the UIIA would be able to be properly assigned to the correct party. Right now we have a few of the ocean carriers that are using that service, and we'll reference those in a couple of slides further in the deck. The administration of the UIIA is actually overseen by a group of 10 industry representatives that consist of members from the motor carrier, ocean, rail, and equipment leasing company sectors. There are 3 voting members for motor carriers, 3 for ocean carriers, 3 for the rail, and then we have 1 voting member for the equipment leasing company. And each of those modes also have alternates that sit on the committee as well in case one of the primary members are unable to attend a meeting or a conference call. One of the alternates would step in for that particular committee member during that time. This committee, what their main goal is to continually review the agreement to ensure that the terms and conditions of the document reflect what's actually going on in the industry as far as business practices that are used by the participants. And there are processes. The agreement has a section of administrative procedures that outline how modifications to the agreement take place. So when this group of this committee meets. They discuss if there's any type of changes that need to be made, and if there are, it requires a 3/4 vote of that committee in order for a change to be effective. And then once the committee determines whether a change should be made before it becomes effective, it then also goes out to all UIA participants. So all motor carriers and all other equipment providers receive notice of the proposed modification, and then they're given a 30-day period to submit comments as to whether they feel there's an issue with allowing that language to move forward and become effective. And then that feedback is then sent back to the Intermodal Interchange Executive Committee before they make a final determination as to whether the change should go into place in the actual document. Once that final vote is taken and the committee determines that they do want to move forward, based on the feedback they receive, they feel that the change should become and be implemented into the agreement. A notification is sent out to all UIA participants, letting them know of the committee's decision and also the effective date of the new language. Other types of activities that the IIC is involved in, the addenda, the EP addenda that I talked about a little earlier. Anytime a provider wants to make a modification to their terms of their addenda, if they're not economic terms, they have to go before the committee and be reviewed by the modal members of that committee. So for example, if a steamship line submitted a change to their addenda, say they were changing one of their lost stolen processes, that information would be prepared and sent to the motor and ocean IIC committee members for review, and they would make a determination if that language was consistent with the agreement. As long as it is, it would be approved and the EP would be allowed to make that change. However, if there are comments, we will discuss in a later slide how that process actually works. They also review requests for interpretations to UIA provisions. So if there's a question as to what language means in the agreement, as long as it doesn't involve a matter that's under dispute, the committee can then take that request and provide the parties with the actual how the language should be interpreted as it is shown in the agreement. The IIC committee members also serve as our arbitration panel members under our binding arbitration process. And again, they consider requests for modifications. Any signatory to the UIIA, whether it be a motor carrier or an equipment provider, can at any time request a change to the agreement. There's a formal process for them to do so. They have to submit an email to myself, and they would indicate what change they would like the committee to consider. And then in addition to that, they would have to provide the proposed language that they would like the committee to look at and the reason why they feel that it should be in the agreement. And then the committee would then take that under advisement and determine whether the proposed language should be a change made to the actual document. And then it would then revert back and go through the process of going out for a 30-day comment period. And then the committee would then make a final determination whether it should be included in the agreement. And lastly, the committee also reviews reports of non-compliance of the terms of the agreement. So if we receive a report from one of our participants that there's a specific party that is not abiding on a repeated basis with the terms and conditions of the agreement, they have the ability to submit a complaint indicating that, and then the panel, the IIC committee would then take that under advisement and determine if any actions are warranted in regards to that. We talked a little bit about the EP addenda and the fact that they can modify an equipment provider can modify the terms of their addenda at any time. So this slide kind of outlines what that process is if a provider wants to do that. I think I mentioned that if a provider wants to submit a change to their addenda, we prepare it and it goes to the specific modal IIC members for review. So again, if it's a motor carrier, if it's a steamship line, it would go to the motor carrier panel members and the ocean carrier panel members. If it's a rail, it would go to the rail and the motor carrier IIC members. Once the IAC members have the proposed language or the proposed revision that the equipment provider wants to make, they have 15 business days to review that information and submit any comments as to whether if they feel that the language needs to be further clarified or if they feel it's not consistent with the agreement. We then summarize those comments and send them back to the provider for them to take any appropriate action. If they need to modify language based on the committee's comments, they may do that. Or if they don't agree with the committee's comments, they would then have the opportunity to schedule a conference call with the modal committee members to address their concerns and hopefully come to a resolution or a compromise on the proposed language. Once the modal members approve the language, then a notice would go out to all UIA participants, letting them know that the equipment provider had changed the terms of their addenda. They're given a 30-day notice of any changes to a provider's addenda. And if for some reason the modal members did not feel the language was consistent with the agreement, for example, if they thought the language was outside the scope of the document, they would then review the matter to the full committee at their next scheduled meeting. So then the proposed language would go to the full committee and they would review it at their next scheduled meeting and make a determination as to whether the equipment provider could move forward with the language or else they would reject the revision if it was not consistent with the base terms of the UIIA. The one thing equipment providers that are modifying their addenda, they need to take into consideration when they submit the information is the timeline that it may take in order for the change to become effective. So if they are targeting a certain effective date, they would want to make sure that they submit it well in advance of that. So in case it does have to go to the committee for review, there'd be sufficient time for that process to take place. One thing, if a provider is only submitting, say, changes to their per diem or free time rate, any type of economic term, if it's like a specific dollar amount, that type of information is not reviewed by the committee. And if that's the case, then what we would do is once we got the change, we would then draft a notice to the motor carriers advising them that there was a change in an economic term contained within that provider's addenda, and then they would be given a 30-day notice of that change. The committee itself is appointed by IANA's board of directors, and the board has a IIC appointment committee that reviews the committee consist each year of the members that are on the committee to make sure that the members that are on the committee are actually doing what they need to do. If they feel that there's any changes that need to be made, they have the opportunity. This IAC committee would then make those recommendations to IANA's board for a review at their January meeting each year. There is a application process where we reach out to UIA participants each year in the fourth quarter and actually solicit interest of UIA signatories that may be interested in serving as an IAC member. They have to complete the application and provide us a copy of their resume, and then we provide that information to the IIC appointment committee for their review in determining whether they feel any changes need to be made to the committee. Currently, there's no term for a sitting IIC committee member unless the IIC appointment committee feels that there needs to be a change to the consist of that committee. So UIA participation, if you're an equipment provider and you wish to join the UIIA, there's certain information you need to meet, the criteria you need to meet in order to be a participant. You have to have an active standard carrier alpha code, which I think I mentioned earlier was a 4-letter code that is recognized by facilities and trucking companies and equipment providers to identify the specific company. We have a signature page to our base agreement that we require all equipment providers to execute. And that's basically they're agreeing to the terms and conditions of the agreement and that they're going to use the UIIA as their interchange agreement when doing business with UIA motor carrier participants. They, again, then would have to draft their addendum to the agreement that would contain their commercial terms such as free time and per diem. and any, say, additional insurance they may require the carrier to have. And if the company is not an ocean or rail carrier, we ask them to complete an annual census document so that we use that information to determine their annual fee. Participation in the UIIA for an equipment provider, the annual fee is based on 3 components. It's the total annual volume, meaning the volume they use the UIIA for is in regards to interchange agreement, how they access our data, and also how many motor carriers we serviced. And the motor carrier serviced is based on whether the equipment provider is opening their participation to all motor carriers, or if there's a specific list of carriers that we're going to be managing for them. And the fees are invoiced each year on the anniversary date of that equipment provider. So whenever they come into the UIIA, we would invoice them the following year on that specific date as well. For a motor carrier to participate in the UIIA, they also have to have a standard carrier alpha code that's active. They have to have active USDOT number and a motor carrier operating authority with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. They have to provide us their federal tax ID number. And in order to make the base requirements of the agreement, there's a section within the UIIA that outlines general insurance requirements that all UIIA participants are required to have in order to actively participate in the program. They include a commercial auto liability policy for $1 million combined single limit. They have to have $1 million general liability policy, of which no portion of that can be self-insured. And the reason for that is because there's no state or federal regulatory agency that authorizes self-insurance for general liability. There's a trucker's uniform intermodal interchange endorsement that we also require, that basically is a hold harmless endorsement that the equipment providers require to be part of a motor carrier's auto liability policy. So basically, if that trucker gets in an accident and there's a APL box on the box of that on the back of that truck, this endorsement precludes a company from suing APL if the motor carrier is in an accident. But that endorsement has to be part of the auto liability policy. And then again, the equipment providers that the motor carrier is doing business with under the UIIA must be listed as additionally insured on the auto liability. In addition to those base requirements for insurance that are entered or that are set forth in the actual base agreement, equipment providers, the majority of them also require additional types of insurance in order for a carrier to be approved for them. And they include cargo. So they request that the carrier provide evidence that they have some type of cargo insurance, and the equipment provider would then specify what limit of cargo insurance they would ask that carrier to have. Trailer interchange, which trailer interchange is a insurance policy that covers the physical damage to non-owned equipment while it's in the motor carrier's care, custody, and or control. So almost all providers require cargo and trailer interchange in addition to the base insurance that you see above on this slide. And then there are also some that require workers' compensation and employer's liability. Oftentimes, if a company only uses owner-operators, they can't provide that coverage because they're not required to carry it. So we do accept a letter on the trucking company's letterhead stating that they are exempt from carrying workers' comp, and we treat that as an insurance policy. So we give them a year from the date of the letter for the exemption, and then each year they have to provide a new letter stating that they're still exempt and the reason why they are exempt. And then some equipment providers also require to be additionally insured on other policies other than auto. They also may ask to be additionally insured on general liability or also on trailer interchange. And the reason they request the additional insured coverage is so that they are they're provided first party insurance coverage. So if there's a claim, they will have first party insurance coverage should the need arise. For insurance, for many years, agents would submit insurance to us via mail, fax, email, and we still get some email documentation from agents. Not so much via fax anymore, but a few stragglers here and there will come in via fax. But what we did develop several years ago was the ability for agents to submit insurance online. So we have a platform where they can go in and register, and we have a registration form where it indicates that they agree to provide accurate and up-to-date information to the UIIA on behalf of their insured, and that if any time that policy information changes, they're responsible to update the information in our system. When we get the registration from the agent, we check to ensure that they have an active license to write insurance, as well as the agency that they're saying that they're a representative of also has an active license. And we do that check once a year for the agents that register. And then once we activate them, each motor carrier is provided with what we call an insurance agent code. And that insurance agent code allows the motor carrier to manage which agents have the ability to submit insurance on their behalf. So if a motor carrier wants their agent to submit insurance for them, the initial time the agent does so, they have to have this insurance agent code that has been provided to them by the motor carrier, and they also have to know the motor carrier's SCAC code. And then once they link that motor carrier to their account, then they could then come online at whatever time they wanted to do any type of updates to that motor carrier's insurance. We also worked several years ago with Accord, which is a company that produces certificates of insurance. And we had our own Accord form developed with them that is specific to requirements that are requested under the UIIA, such as specific endorsements we ask for and the additional insured language that we require. And that form is what we use. We require if an agent's going to send the information to us via email, they have to send it on that form. And when the agent submits the insurance online, if we reproduce that certificate for, say, an equipment provider may request us to provide evidence of coverage. When we reproduce that certificate, it's reproduced on the Accord 22 certificate of insurance. And agents, once they submit insurance online to us, at any time they have the ability to come into their account, see any of the insurance certificates they've issued, whether they're expired or active. They have the ability to access any of that information and download it should they the need arise for them to have a copy of it, as well as coming online and providing information when policies terminate. And when a terminated policy may be reinstated, they have the ability to come online and do that as well. So I would say probably we deal with approximately 3,500 to 4,000 insurance agents on behalf of the 8,000 motor carriers that are in our database. And I would say probably about 85% of them submit insurance online to us at this point. And then, we're constantly trying to review the process to try to make sure that it's streamlined for the insurance agents, and we will continue to do that. But it certainly has reduced the amount of paperwork that we are required to handle based on the fact that now agents can submit insurance online, as well as it benefits motor carriers because it allows their agent to submit that information 24/7 versus having to wait for an actual representative to be there to handle it. Other provisions in the UIIA that are often referenced are billing timeframes. We have specific billing timeframes under the base agreement for an equipment provider to be able to bill for per diem. So they have 60 days from the date that the motor carrier returns the equipment to bill the motor carrier for any type of per diem charges that they are responsible for. If for some reason they bill the incorrect party, say they were given incorrect information and maybe the provider sent the bill to the wrong party, they have the ability to transmit that information to the correct party, but they have to do so in no more than 90 days from the date the equipment was returned. And all of our notices under the UIIA are required to be sent via email between the parties. There's also maintenance and repair billing timeframes. As you can see, the three types of billing timeframes for maintenance and repair include those that occur at a standard gate, where there are gate personnel at that gate. In that case, they have the provider has 165 calendar days from the date of the interchange at the time the damage was documented to bill the motor carrier. At an AGS gate, where it's an automatic gate, they have 120 calendar days, and for over-the-road repairs, they have 90 calendar days from the date of repair. And for the over-the-road repairs, the provider does have the ability within their addendum to set forth a different time frame. However, that different time frame can be no less than 45 days, and it has to be reciprocal for both the motor carrier and the equipment provider. So the motor carrier billing for a reimbursement of charges would have to have the same billing time frame as the equipment provider would have to bill the motor carrier. Many of our equipment providers, they elect to receive data in various ways in regards to update their own internal systems with the interchange status information. Some use our web interface, or simply they would go on and do motor carrier lookups, or they'd be able to pull scheduled reports of approved or not approved carriers. And then others use our EDI, where they receive an electronic data feed from our office at a specific frequency that they would select. And then many also receive the data via XML and API, which is the most efficient method to receive the information. We talked a little earlier about the terminal feed service, which is one of our value-added services. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but basically this allows the interchange information to be expedited to the parties that need it in order to ensure that the truckers coming in the facilities can get out of the gate and they are aware whether they have a valid or not approved UIA interchange with a specific ocean carrier steamship line, ocean carrier railroad or equipment leasing company. Again, we talked a little bit about our street interchange application in an earlier slide, and you can see here where right now we have Hapag-Lloyd, Hyundai, Mediterranean Shipping, Yangming, and an Evergreen that use that service, and they're all UIA equipment providers, and they use our street interchange application to get requests for street turns or street interchange from UIA motor carrier participants, and then they in turn would then transmit information back as to whether that that transaction was approved or not. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of our program managers, Sherry Parnell. She handles all the administration associated with our dispute resolution and binding arbitration process. And she's going to walk through a little bit about how that process works for UIA participants. Sherry?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go over the overview of the binding arbitration timelines. In order to submit a claim under the binding arbitration process, you must initially dispute the invoice with the equipment provider within 30 days from the date you received your invoice, or within the time frame set forth in the provider's addendum. If there is no resolution between the parties, the motor carrier would have 15 calendar days from the equipment provider's denial of your dispute to submit the claim for binding arbitration. Once the claim has been received by our office with all of the backup documentation, our office will put the claim together and submit the information to the involved equipment provider for comment. The equipment provider will have 15 days to submit comments and supporting documentation presenting their arguments in response to the motor carrier's position in the claim. Once our office receives the comments from the equipment provider, we will forward all of the information to the binding arbitration panel members for review. They will have 45 days to render their decision in the case. Once the decision has been rendered, our office will notify the involved parties, the equipment provider and the motor carrier, of the decision, and the involved parties will have 15 days to comply with the panel's determination in the claim. Let's see. The criteria for the acceptable binding arbitration claim. For your claim to be accepted under the binding arbitration process, your claim must be related to an invoice for per diem, maintenance and repair, or equipment use rental charges. You would need to provide documentation showing that you have properly disputed the invoice with the established time frame in the equipment provider's addendum, or absent a dispute resolution process in the provider's addendum, Section H1 of the UIIA would apply. The claim would need to be submitted to our office with all the backup documentation within 15 days from the date your company received a response from the equipment provider. Okay, initiating the claim. I don't know if you can go to the website, Debbie. You can get the packet off of our website, and the packet tells you all of the information that you'll need to provide your claim to our office. So if you scroll down, you go to www.uiia.org, scroll down past the orange box to the binding arbitration process, and you want to click on Download Arbitration Packet. If you pull that up, you can click on that. This is the form you'll need to complete. You'll need to complete part 1 of the notice of intent, and then you'll scroll down to your basis of dispute, and this is a form that you can actually type on. So you can put in your basis of dispute, which is the reason why you're disputing the invoice. You'll need to provide the UIIA provision that the claim is on, and also provide us with the invoice number or numbers that involve in this dispute. And again, it needs to be per diem, maintenance and repair, equipment use, or rental charges, amount being disputed, the date invoice received by motor carrier, so the date you received the invoices, the date invoice was disputed, and the date the EP responded to your dispute. All of the information that's required is outlined underneath that section that we were just on, that shows copies of all invoices should be submitted along with the case. You would need to provide all of the email communication showing the initial dispute of the invoices. The email communication should be in date order and be forwarded with all attachments that were included in the email message. All of the in and out gate EIR documentation associated with the invoices under the dispute should be provided. In cases involving maintenance and repair charges, these need to include the repair bill as well as any recorded images. The images must be in JPEG format in order for them to be accepted. And then you can provide any other documentation that supports your claim and that would like to be arbitration panel to consider for your arbitration claim. The prior case decisions. Upon review of the submitted claim, if you believe that the claim has already been addressed and resolved in a prior decision, we will do the following. The claim will be dismissed. A copy of the previous decision will be forwarded to the involved parties, to the motor carrier and the equipment provider. The decision in the former proceeding will apply to the current claim. The involved parties, the motor carrier and equipment provider, will have 10 days to review the information provided and to provide additional information on why the precedent decision does not apply to the current claim or why it poses a conflict with the agreement. If additional information is provided, we will review the information in our office and will move forward with the claim. If the claim is determined to meet criteria, it will be forwarded to the equipment provider for comment. They will have 15 days to provide their comments. Once comments are received, the case will be forwarded to the binding arbitration panel members for review and determination. The arbitration decisions. The arbitration panel members will have 45 days to review and render their decision. Once the decision has been rendered, both parties, the motor carrier and the equipment provider, will be notified of that decision. The losing party will be responsible for all the arbitration fees that are associated with the case. No appeal process is offered and all decisions are final. Sorry about that. All prior arbitration case decisions have been uploaded on the UIIA website for a reference to the motor carriers wanting to submit a claim and to determine if a previous decision for a case with similar circumstances has already been reviewed and rendered by the panel. That's also on our website where Debbie was just at. It was just the button beside the packet. But you can get all this information off of our website at www.uiia.org. And I'll send it back over to Debbie to finish the webinar.
Thanks, Sherry.
Mhm.
Our arbitration panel members, again, are comprised of our IIC, the Intermodal Interchange Executive Committee that oversees the agreement. We have 5 teams that we rotate on a monthly basis so that each arbitration panel team will receive a case. Cases are reviewed by the actual modal arbitration panel member. So if the case involves an ocean carrier and a motor carrier, it would go to the panel member, an ocean carrier panel member and a motor carrier panel member for review. If those 2 modal representatives are unable to reach a decision, then it goes to a senior arbitration panel, which is comprised of our longest tenured IAC members. And that would go to an ocean, motor, and rail carrier for review and final determination. And they would then render the final decision in the case. All of our arbitration panel members render their decision based on the terms and conditions of the UIIA and any terms and conditions contained in the provider's addenda. Some of the questions we get regarding our dispute resolution process many times is the ability for an EP to suspend a motor interchange privileges due to an outstanding per diem or M&R matter. And one of the guidelines under our binding arbitration process states that once the charges are disputed and then put under or submitted for binding arbitration, that an EP cannot suspend, an equipment provider cannot suspend that motor carrier's interchange privileges for the charges under arbitration until that arbitration case has been rendered by the panel. And if for some reason a motor carrier's privileges are suspended, then they would contact our office and we would then contact the equipment provider indicating that they have to reinstate that carrier until the arbitration final decision in the arbitration case has been rendered. Just want to run through some frequently asked questions that we get from participants regarding the UIIA. Many times we'll be asked if a broker can participate in the UIIA, and the answer to that question is yes, they can. There's nothing to preclude them from participating as long as they can meet the requirements. However, that's usually the obstacle because many times a broker cannot meet the insurance requirements under the UIIA because they don't have any assets. So the question is they can participate, but again, many times they aren't able to meet the requirements. The United States Postal Service, we often get asked if they would participate in the UIIA, and the answer to that question is no, they do not. Most of the equipment providers have their own individual commercial contracts with the U.S. Postal Service, and that's outside of the UIIA. Where to go? Where do parties that are interested in participating in the UIIA go to apply? And on our UIIA website, there are drop downs for equipment providers and motor carriers that will provide them access to either apply online or to submit the actual paperwork, paper documents to apply for UIIA participation. The annual fee for a motor carrier to participate in the UIIA is $344 a year, and they're billed on an anniversary basis. So whenever they come into the UIIA, they would be billed that following year on the same and in the same month. I think I talked a little bit about companies that are exempt from carrying workers' comp. How we handle that is that we require the carrier to provide us a letter on their company letterhead, and we treat that as an insurance policy, and they have to include the reason for the exemption, and we give them a year from the date of the letter, and they would have to return that letter each year. Trailer interchange insurance, again, most equipment providers do require that the motor carrier carry this coverage because it's going to cover any type of physical damage that occurs to their equipment, the equipment provider's equipment, while it's in that motor carrier's possession or control. An equipment provider, oftentimes they may ask, can they waive one of their insurance requirements for a carrier? Say, for example, a motor carrier may only haul their own goods, so they may not carry cargo insurance that a provider may request from all carriers. So the equipment provider would have the ability within our platform to go in and waive that cargo coverage for that specific motor carrier in order so they would meet their requirements. So once the waiver's entered, then our system wouldn't look at cargo for that specific motor carrier when calculating their status for that particular equipment provider. And some dispute resolution FAQs that we get often are: how many days does the motor carrier have to dispute an invoice? There are provisions within the UIIA under section H1 that indicate that if a provider does not have a dispute process within its addenda, then the motor carrier has 30 days from the date it receives the invoice to dispute the charges with the individual provider. And again, that same provision also indicates that the equipment provider has 30 days from the date they receive the motor carrier's dispute to provide them with a response as to whether they accept their dispute or if they decline their dispute. And once they decline the dispute, that's when the clock would start. Should the motor carrier want to go further with that dispute and submit it for binding arbitration, they would have 15 calendar days from the date the equipment provider declines their dispute to decide whether they want to submit it for binding arbitration. And if an equipment provider wants to suspend a motor carrier's interchange privileges, there are also provisions within the UIIA that set forth how many days notice they have to give that carrier before they can do so. So the two provisions, section C2 and G14C, both establish that a motor carrier has to be provided with no less than 3 business days notice anytime a provider is going to suspend their interchange for whatever reason that suspension may be related to. The other questions we get sometimes are: what does an EP have to provide the motor carrier when they're providing them with an invoice to determine that they are holding that motor carrier responsible? There is a section within the UIIA that states that the provider must include factual documentation along with their invoice to show or to provide evidence that they feel this motor carrier is responsible for the charges. And that factual documentation can be, the majority of the time, is a copy of the equipment interchange receipt showing that that motor carrier actually was interchanged that equipment, or it showed when the damage, if it was a damage invoice, when the damage was captured at the end gate of the equipment. As administrators of the UIIA, we do not get involved in invoicing disputes between parties to the agreement. We basically provide the parties with what is available to them under the UIIA, which would be the ability to dispute the invoice with the actual equipment provider. And then if there's no resolution, then they can be afforded the opportunity to submit it for binding arbitration. But we do not adjudicate invoicing issues between participants. And the last question here was in regards to what constitutes an EP's response. We get that sometimes because there'll be ongoing communication between the parties, and they may ask for additional information before they actually, the equipment provider may ask for additional documentation from the motor carrier before they actually provide them, whether they yes or no, whether they agree with their dispute. So when the equipment provider comes back and says we decline or reject the dispute, that's considered their response. And we just included a few screenshots from the application in the deck here that basically show, this particular screenshot shows the equipment providers, the online platform that the equipment providers have the access to, where they can look up a specific motor carrier. Once they click on that name, it would bring up the details for that motor carrier. It would show whether they're approved or not approved. And then if they click on this, like if they were not approved, they could click on the not approved, and it would show the actual information that motor carrier needed in order to have a valid interchange with this equipment provider. This shows a snapshot of the detailed screen for a motor carrier. As you can see, it has contact information over on this side. It has active status information, whether the motor carrier is active in the UIIA, and also whether they're approved with that specific equipment provider. It gives a snapshot of their insurance information, as well as provides the ability for the equipment provider to waive insurance requirements. I think we talked a little bit about that. And then this additional information in this box here is where if the equipment provider wanted to cancel the motor carrier's interchange, they'd click the cancel motor carrier button here, and that would give them the ability to enter a date as to what date they're canceling that motor carrier's interchange. And then it also has a few other fields that are available in that block. The waive requirement screen for an equipment provider simply shows that provider's limits, and then there's a grant waiver flag as to whether the motor carrier can, as to whether the equipment provider can waive that requirement for the motor carrier. If they want to, they would select this drop down to yes, and then enter a -1 in the limit for the insurance, and that tells our system that when you calculate the validation for this particular motor carrier, do not look at this coverage. And then we would do that and determine whether the carrier had a valid interchange based on the waiver. The reporting capability that I mentioned earlier is through our web report generator. And I know this screen is rather small, but basically there's a report generator screen here where the equipment provider can fill in different parameters as to what they're looking for, whether it be carriers with a specific insurance limit, a list of approved or not approved carriers. They fill in the parameters here, they'd scroll down to the bottom of the screen, and then they would be able to click on a button that would generate an Excel file that would allow them to receive the report. There's also the ability to schedule reports. So if they want a, say, an approved carrier list every day at a certain time, they can schedule that report so it's automatically generated and emailed to them at that time each day. And with that, that kind of concludes the slides that we have. I know it was a lot of information to digest, and certainly we'll make this presentation available to Beto so that if anyone is interested in having the presentation, we can do that as well. Sherry, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have one. Do you get notifications if they stop payment of the insurance or they cancel their insurance, or you have to look that up?
We will get notification. There is a provision within the agreement that requires that the motor carrier is obligated to notify UIIA if their policies are terminated or if there's any type of change to their insurance information. So we're required to get a 30-day advance notice of any cancellations to a policy unless it's for non-payment. And then if it's for non-payment, the agent's required to give us a 10-day notification. So yes, we do receive those notifications. I'm sure there are times we may not get the notice, but the motor carrier is contractually obligated to make sure we do get those notifications. So if there was an issue where the notice wasn't received, there would be a contractual obligation there on the side of the motor carrier to ensure that that information had been provided to us through their agent.
And that's it.
That's all the questions?
That's it.
Okay, well, Beto, then I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie, and also thank to you, Sherry. Sorry. Well, I think it's very illustrative, all the information that you shared today. I know we've had previous conversations about that. This, I mean, again, this is very learning for us on the process that we have on the implementation of the interchange agreement that we're trying to put in place down here in Mexico. So thanks again for sharing all this information. I'm sure that it will help us a lot to go through a successful implementation of ours, and obviously to provide that added value to the members of the AMTI and the equipment owners and the motor carriers as well. Some of the equipment owners that we have, we also have them down here. So I think that can make it run smoother, obviously, but we'll have a challenge on the other side while implementing the agreement. I mean, again, thanks for that. I'm sure that once we have our agreement in place, we'll be looking, or we'll be finding some synergies together. And as I have mentioned before, there might be some possibilities of creating synergies around the border operations that definitely we see there is some chance to work together. So To the IANA staff, thanks again for putting all these together. Debbie, Sherry, John, thanks for all your help and support. And thanks everybody on the AMTI community for joining and taking the time to listen to our IANA friends about what's the agreement they have in place and all the benefits that they clearly showed that they have within the industry. I don't have anything else to say. Debbie, if you want to say something else, please go ahead. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Beta, the only thing I wanted to add was that, as I indicated, we'll forward this presentation to you, and we also recorded this session, so we'll send you a link once that's available. So in case there's anyone that wasn't able to join, you can send them the link to the presentation and the PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Debbie. And obviously, we'll share the presentation for anybody that asked that to AMTI. We'll share the presentation and the audio as well. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.